lose friends, you lose, relationships with partners even, and it's difficult because you can't always put it into words when you explain it to people, because other kids and such, and even adults, don't understand where you come from and how you kind of see things.
Fern, now 16 years old, has been a young carer for as long as she can remember. Anyone can become a carer at any time, but it's especially tough when you're already battling the challenges of childhood. Until the law changed last year, there was little realistic chance that a young carer such as Fern would be spotted and spared a special kind of solitude.
It is isolation, but it's also isolation inside the family, because it can't be discussed what's happening. In physical care, you can at least discuss with your parent the nature of their illness. Often in mental illness, you can't. And there may even be denial of what the child's role is, or even hostility towards the child. You drove me mad, parents often say, don't they? There's the stigma, which is a different stigma for just caring, but the stigma of mental illness on top of it. And it's also the stigma for the young person, feeling that they are from a bad family, so there must be something wrong with them.
The Care Act and the Children and Families Act broke new legal ground by switching the burden. No longer a need for the young carer to put their hand up and be recognised, but a legal duty on their local council to seek out and support. The landmark law was hailed as a breakthrough for carers' rights, but a year on, how much has truly changed? Is the mental health of young carers still at risk? Carers World Investigates can reveal a system that's missing the point, with one vital question remaining unanswered. Are professionals, campaigners and politicians in the right frame of mind? We start our search for answers with 16-year-old Fern, for whom the daily reality continues unchecked by a change in the law.
You have to wash your clothes yourself, you have to go to school and be 10 minutes late because your parent doesn't want them socialised for their disabilities or their mental, physical things. And then you realise to yourself that you are such different, even though you don't want to be. Even though I lived 6 doors away from my first school, it was always a struggle as getting up. My mum would be in bed for 2-3 weeks at a time, crying, different people come around the house and you wouldn't understand it because you didn't know. They're just, assuming it and jumping to the conclusion, whereas they should be really asking you and not just telling you you're okay.
Asking you and not telling you that you're okay would be a good start to professional spotting that Fern is a young carer. Her words show the reason why the Care Act and the Children and Families Act gave such hope, all wrapped up in one very simple, special reason.
It's the first time that young carers have actually been mentioned in the law. In order to help a young carer in the past, you had to call them a child in need. So, very positive.
How are these duties supposed to be implemented in practice?
If you start with sort of the sharp edge of the law, it just says that where it appears to a local authority, so that's anybody within a local authority, a school teacher or anybody employed by any arm of the local authority, where it appears to them that a young carer may have needs, they must assess. So that means they don't have to, the young carer has to ask, their parents don't have to ask, the authority must assess. And a young carer is defined as somebody under 18 who provides care, so it doesn't have to be inappropriate or substantial. So in theory, there's a very low trigger for an assessment. As soon as somebody within the authority knows that somebody's a young carer, they must assess.
The school, therefore, has, in that example, has an obligation to identify, recognise and support the young carer?
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of the local authority, and the local authority has the duty. So the local authority's got to make sure that that duty is fulfilled by everybody that works within it. The school should know exactly what its legal responsibilities are and who in the local authority to contact if it's sort of something that they need additional support with.
If a school knows about a young carer, what are the consequences for the school of not identifying, recognising and supporting that young carer?
Well, none, I suppose, unless something goes wrong. If it goes wrong, then I think the school can get into difficulty. But the reality is there are no significant penalties.
So, for local council, read anyone connected with it. With no penalties other than possibly bad publicity, there's no incentive on schools to avoid what Fern experienced next.
I was bullied for not just my weight, because of my brother. As you grow up, you kind of have to always follow your siblings, whereas if your sibling's different to you, then they don't, you know, think you've got different problems because you're the same people as such. Whereas school, I was bullied, I was put into situations that should have never happened. I did tell about when my brother as such was physical towards us. I told the school and they called my mum, where my mum said that it wasn't happening because of her own mental health and she didn't want to affect that, and then the school thought I was lying. So I was apparently, as they actually said to me, "You're like the boy that cried wolf," whereas that wasn't the case. They just...
To what extent did the school know that you were a young carer?
I told them all the time where I couldn't go into school because my mum was ill, or why you always late because my mum, or we didn't have clothes, or you know, growing up as a kid even, you kind of want to be popular, you want to wear nice clothes, you want to look smart as such, whereas growing up I didn't have that choice.
So what was the impact of bullying on Fern's daily life?
It was wear something the next day, then have to wear the same outfit even though it's not been washed. And it puts me off now, as now I kind of have to have 3 or 4 showers a day, which has affected me from as early to now. And it probably will do for quite a lot of years.
We're looking at a range of professionals on the programme. In terms of the school, what do you believe the school could have done differently?
They could have actually acknowledged that, you know, that people can be different, and that as I grew up, we kind of, till the age of 13, I was probably a very good child. I was never shouting in class, I was never, you know, acknowledged. And then when I noticed other children that were using violence, using bad language to get what they wanted, I done it. And as soon as I did, I got like a lot of support, I got help, I got noticed, and I got attention, and that's all I really wanted. Because, as you say, you go home, you don't speak to anyone because everyone's upset, or you wake up not knowing whether one person's going to be in a mood, because it does set off everyone else in the household. It's not just the fact of thinking, oh, this one person's going to set off, it's everyone. And if we disagree, it's a big thing. If you say certain things, you can't always, you have to tippy-toe around it, and it's hard. And still to this day, my mum will sit there and not acknowledge that I'm a carer. She kind of doesn't see it like that. So you get treated as an adult from a young age, but then if you want to actually do the kind of things like a child or an adult would do, as such as go out with friends, you don't have that. You just have the emotional and physical support, as I said, as an adult, but not the actual being treated as one.
What about your classmates and your friends? How did they react to the experiences you were going through?
I never really had friends growing up. I kind of had to learn, as I said, to be on my own. I'd rather be on my own now, because then I know that no one's going to judge me, whereas at one point I used to get bullied for being fat, and now I will sit there and call myself these names, because if I do it and people notice I do it, they won't tend to do it. So my classmates as such would always be like, well, Fern's not coming in, you know, she's out doing this, she's out doing that, and getting called a chav, because, as I say, you don't really have that many clothes, whereas a pair of jeans you can't always wear, a tracksuit you can kind of wear as you go along. So it's kind of me going to school in leggings instead of school trousers, and trainers because they were my only shoes instead of proper school shoes. So it was difficult having to explain to people that I couldn't afford or couldn't do these things. I'd never been on a school trip, because even though I had the money, it wasn't the fact of being to go, it was, well, if I go then people might say something, I'd just rather be on my own all the time.
What do you feel schools should be doing that they're not doing?
Acknowledging it, and there is good teachers out there, whereas the learning support assistants, if you've noticed, they will help you a lot more, because they haven't got, you know, just the professional side as such off the books, whereas some people put it. They will actually use their own mother instinct or father instinct as such to realise that we're children. We are growing up, and there is so many difficulties within generations, and it's just getting worse, it's not getting better, and they need to, you know, use, as I put it, a bit of their mother instinct or father instinct to put towards these certain things, instead of just, you know, well, it doesn't say it in the book that we learn, it doesn't say it in the training we had, but we're still going to acknowledge it, whereas they don't do that.
What Fern and other young carers say they seek is nothing more than a little humanity and to be able to have a conversation. The Association of School and College Leaders has published a survey recently which concluded that mental health problems among school children are on the increase. Yet the association says that staff have never been better equipped for the critical task of being approachable.
Teachers will all be trained in safeguarding, so they'll know the kind of things to be looking out for, concerns. So any kinds of concerns that they may have about young people in school, they'll have a procedure and a multi-agency working approach to discuss those issues. And we also, in our survey, we did also ask questions of schools around what kind of support that they offer themselves. So there'll be a whole load of things that schools are doing within schools to support young people. They'll be looking out for things, any kind of safeguarding issues, and then they'll be making referrals as appropriate to outside organisations.
What sort of training do teachers have to be able to do that? Is it just simply a matter of common sense in a way and professional judgment?
It is definitely a matter of common sense and professional judgment, but schools will also have all sorts of training, part of their continuous professional development within schools. So every school will have a safeguarding lead who has a lot of training, very specific training, but then they will bring in all staff for all sorts of other training as well.
Is it the case then really that teachers and other school professionals should be approachable?
Absolutely. I mean, I think open dialogue and having good relationships is the key to all of this stuff. And what you'll find is that some young people will gravitate towards some staff in schools, some teachers, maybe other staff, and some will gravitate to others, and that's just human nature. So yes, absolutely. Good open relationships, modelling good open relationships amongst staff and then between staff and students is absolutely key to spotting these kinds of things.
And Fern's reaction to teachers being approachable?
That is probably one of the most things that I've heard that is far from the truth. Fair enough, there's certain teachers that have learned from that perspective, but it's not from professionals, it's not from, Ofsted or places like that. It's generally from their own instincts and possibly breaking a couple rules, doing it where it should be an actual natural reaction for anyone to do it.
Again, reinforcement from Fern that all that young carers need is simple human concern and understanding. But what of the police? An even more frightening experience awaited her at the hands of the law.
I've been arrested. I've told them that I was a young carer and that I had to get home just because as such I was wearing a tracksuit, and I was let out 7 to 8 hours later with no acknowledgement, nothing done wrong because of certain circumstances I was going through, and yet come home to a parent that had suffered from that and self-harmed as such and things like that, because there is no understanding of when you tell these people these things, such as the police, they're not acknowledging that, they're just seeing from their, as they're saying, they're doing their job, but they're not doing their job. They're just trying to, I understand, put the younger generation away from certain crimes and things like that nowadays and trying to point us away and learn us from an early age. But at the same time, they've got to listen and not just tell people these things. They've got to, sit down, and when you arrest someone, actually try and get to the bottom of it, let them speak, instead of just, oh, you've been arrested, you've now done this, you've done this, and, sit in this cell on your own and not speak to anyone, where it can be lonely because, you're in a place you don't know and there's people shouting, and in these certain places there is a lot of older and influence. You can't be shoved into a situation where you feel trapped, and that's what they do. They just trap you without giving you the acknowledgement of what you need, and that, we are a child, we're a minor as such in some circumstances, and they're not seeing it as that, they're just seeing, you're breaking the law, you're this, you're that, when in reality they should dig deeper before they can fill that surface as such.
So it's all procedure in your experience?
Yeah, they need to realise that, we are a different generation to what they may have grown up in, whereas where I've grown up is different to what my nan's grown up, or what anyone in this world, and they're not putting that into their jobs. They, everyone says you shouldn't be treated differently, but I believe you should, because if you are, then that is different circumstances, where, as I told them, I'm claustrophobic, I get paranoid in certain little rooms, and yet they didn't understand that I was still shoved into a room at an early age. They're not understanding it as an actual problem, they're kind of just dealing with it how they've been taught, and it is under, as a lot of people say, under the books, where it should be using your own instinct, your own initiative, instead of having to follow something all the time.
Initiative, common sense, and not rigidly following the book. That's what Fern and other young carers say will make a real difference to how they are treated. Taking this away from Fern's individual experiences, the police accept that their school report reads, could do better when it comes to handling the point of crisis on first response to an emergency call.
Unfortunately, a lot of the time it's at a point of crisis where, something has happened that means that they would need some particular support or intervention with either the person they're caring for or, a crisis point of some kind that we would often get involved in. So I would say that's the most common area is at point of crisis.
Given that emotions are probably running high at that point, how easy or difficult is it for a police officer to step away from that immediate crisis and maybe look behind the scenes a little?
I think that is the area of work that we need to get better at. I think that some officers are fantastic at doing that, and I think a lot of officers have a way to go. And it's one of our big messages for officers in working with children and young people is to actually kind of look behind the bit that you're being confronted with and actually think about what the backstory is, what's happened, what has led to this point, and what else could we do to make a difference going forward. Let's not just deal with that incident, but actually think about what might make a difference and who we might need to make referrals and get support from.
Does this mean that it would perhaps be a good idea, and maybe you have already specialist officers who, rather than, it's not necessarily, say, a situation of a child in danger, but simply a crisis that's occurred, but out of something that may have just been within the family network with a young carer involved there, maybe looking after a brother or sister as well as a parent?
That's a really interesting debate, and one that we're starting to have, because we have child protection specialist officers who deal with pure child protection incidents, and we have kind of schools officers, and some forces do have sort of youth specific officers. But I think one of our challenges is that because of the unpredictability of knowing when something may crop up that an officer needs to respond to, I would be a little bit reluctant to have specialist youth officers within a kind of response team, because then they become the ones that deal with young people, and the other officers become completely de-skilled in dealing with young people. And I think maybe it's a bit of a utopia, but I'd like to get to the point where all officers would be able to respond in a sensitive and caring way to those kind of incidents.
So this is perhaps more an issue of going to the basic training, police officers, when they start in the service.
There is quite a bit now within the basic training that looks at safeguarding vulnerability and the issues that we'd really like them to think of, from a more caring perspective. I think probably getting that rolled out, that's going to take time to run through an organisation and change a culture, which is really what we're talking about here, is a shift in culture from actually seeing a young person and treating them as a young person first, rather than looking at them as a potential offender or maybe, the circumstances that they're approaching them in. But to put them as children first and child-focused policing is an aspiration, but we've got a long way to get there. So we need to think about how to train our officers who've got, quite a bit of experience, and how to think about giving them the skills to treat children and young people in a different way.
Fern welcomes this move by the National Police Chiefs Council to make the officer first on scene more individually human in his or her response.
Certain people don't like being touched, some people don't like being talking to in a certain way, and they've got to understand that, as you said, this person said that they need to get better. They need to start before they can get better, because I don't see any sort of acknowledgement of these different cultures, these different religions, these different beliefs, in fact. Whereas, if you go and arrest a Muslim or someone with them cultures or background, you're not allowed to touch them, you're not allowed to search them. But because, as such, we're British, we're white, we don't have that kind of, we're Christians as such as I am, then we're fine with it. Whereas it's not the fact of that.
Although police contact may be more the exception than the rule, schools play a large part in the life of a young carer, as probably do the social workers. As Fern explains, as a profession, young carers fear that social workers may do more harm than good unless something changes.
I had 4 different social workers, and every single person I've seen, I've only seen up to twice. They say to you, you know, they get involved into your home life saying, oh, your parent's a bad parent because they're not doing certain things. But then when you actually look deeper into it, and you know, I've had certain ones take me out just to get me away from the home to see what I'm like away from the family, and you tell them every single thing they want to hear, it go down on a piece of paper, and then that's kind of all it is really. You don't get any, oh, you've left into a deep hole where you can't get out of because you want to know these things. Whereas, as I said, with violence, they say, oh, you shouldn't be in the household, we should take you away, but they're not dealing with the bigger problem. They're just trying to put you in different places so they can, you know, get the paperwork over as such, and not acknowledge it into the sense of there's a bigger picture of what's going on. They're just kind of circling a certain thing, as they say, like a Where's Wally book. They circle the thing without looking anywhere else first, and then that's wrong because families are destroyed. You know, people are taken away because they're young carers and they're going through certain abuse. And some senses, yeah, I agree with it because there's certain people that should not be able to. But then they're not looking that it can make people's mental health worse, not just the parent, but the child. And, you know, people grow up with difficulties, but then at the same time they should realise that we're not all going to be the same need. We all need different things, and it is being treated differently. We need to. Instead of just everyone's the same. I mean, everyone's grown up within schools. Never treat someone differently because we're all the same. Never be an individual as such. But it shouldn't be that. We are all individuals. We all have our own things. And the way I cope is I like to be in control of something because most of my life all I've had to do is follow other people's what they're saying. So my piercings and my makeup and things, they're my cover-up to what I can be in control of. Whereas other things you can't control, and that's difficult to balance it.
The new official approach is to talk to the whole family, but is this a method that can really work in practice?
I've had a certain amount of people that have tried to sit my whole family down and get us to speak, but it didn't work out because we had our views, we said what we wanted to say, and then they walked out the door. Most people don't understand is what happens while professionals are in the house can sometimes be faked. You know, you're not getting the full understories, whereas you could bug someone, put a microphone in someone's house and you'd hear it all. But then if someone comes in the house, you could act, you know, someone different, and they're trying to balance it onto, oh, this is what we've seen, so this is what we'll go by, whereas not as, this is what they're trying to perceive. You know, families perceive professionals because they don't want people to get involved. We don't want their children to be taken away because it is a fine line of you say something, then it's a major problem, but yet they should be focusing on whatever you say, we will deal with, not whatever you say, we may take it to so-and-so, we may take it to here and you won't get an answer. Don't speak to people and say that without, you know, actions speak louder than words. Never promise to help people and to get involved but then say you can't do anything, because that can make people worse and make people think that they haven't got anyone and they are lonely and, you know, nothing's going to happen.
Why do you think they walked out?
Because they don't know what to say. They have no, you know, they're told go to this family's house, have a mediation of their families, but that's all they're told. They're not told to kind of leave it like that. They kind of go, and then it kicks off in the household because you've now opened up to everyone, told each other what you think. But like I said, actions, there's no actions, it's just speaking.
Later on we'll hear from the British Association of Social Workers, but for now the London Borough of Newham responds to concerns that Fern and other young carers have raised on the issue of social workers.
It takes time to build relationships with people, and fundamentally that's essentially, it's a real essential part of social work. It's using a range of skills, Tom, to try and identify and tease out whether or not the story is kind of fitting the wider circumstances. So, for example, it isn't just about going in, all guns blazing, and presenting the customer and or their family and carers with a range of questions. It's also about using a range of kind of more soft skills, if you like, to try and work towards a comfortable environment where people feel confident and able to share what's happening to them. I would say from experience that we don't necessarily take everything at face value. It's also perhaps working with partner agencies and organisations, trying to work with schools around education for the young people, our health colleagues, and in some circumstances housing as well. So there's no guarantee that what we're being told is the absolute truth, but what we need to do is to develop a rapport with the customer and their families and use a range of skills to try and tease out what the primary issues are. Some local authorities may be further ahead in the game of implementing changes, changing culture, understanding how the Care Act and the Children and Families Act has changed or influenced practice. But it's definitely a work in progress with more conversations required.
One of the points that's been made by a number of contributors to this programme is that when it comes to young people, that there is a tendency to believe the adult as opposed to the young person. In the case of Fern's story that we're telling through this programme, the school believed her mother with mental health issues rather than her as a young carer.
I think that's very unfortunate, and it's not the first time I've actually heard that. And I think, what we need to do is to reflect, basically. I mean, I know I'm not talking specifically about Fern and her circumstances. I'm talking more generally that social workers do need to understand that children and young people have a voice also, and it's about being explorative. It needs to explore the situation more fully before one can conclude one way or the other. So if adult social worker has gone into a family situation, or in Fern's case where the school had contacted mum and mum gave the impression that all was well, in my professional view, I think further exploration was required, perhaps a referral to children and young people services, or networking into sort of voluntary sector family support service in the community that could have perhaps done more investigative work with Fern and her family to try and get to the bottom of what the presenting issues were.
According to Gráinne Siggins, Director of Adult Social Services, it's all about what Fern and other young carers want.
There's something about a conversation and dialogue and establishing a relationship of trust in that environment that you're in, not just going in with your assessment form to complete. And I think it's about the skill of the social worker in actually trying to understand and engage with that family to try to understand, develop a rapport, understand what is really going on. And it might be over a number of visits, it might be by triangulating information, but I think it's about the skill of the social worker in actually trying to establish that so they get a real reflection of what's actually going on in that family. And I actually argue that that is what we should all be actually doing when we go into somebody's home. We recognise that we're actually going into somebody's home environment. We've been invited into that home environment, being clear about why we're there, trying to understand from the family, to be able to listen, so to actually engage effectively. And you do hear stories where social workers go in with forms in front of them just to actually complete boxes, and actually without trying to establish what is really going on for the family to talk through what is going on day to day and just to understand what those dynamics look and feel like. So I always advocate the conversation and completing the form as part of that, but actually saying what the purpose of the form is, being clear about the purpose of the visit, the information you're trying to glean, what the next steps are going to be, how social workers or social care might aim to support an individual, and it's just to talk people through those steps so they're not worrying about, well, what's next and why are you here. So it is actually part of the skill of the social worker in putting the family and the individuals at ease and being clear about what they're going to be doing next and sticking to that. Often we still hear situations where social workers then don't get back to people, don't give them copies of assessments, aren't probably engaged in a support plan, and it is almost like a test. So I think it is about engaging with the spirit, I would argue, of the Care Act, and to actually really get to understand from a support and resilience perspective how we can support that family, and it is in the skill of the social worker.
So what would you say to those local authorities who may be watching this programme and thinking, actually, you know what, we're not doing that? How can they go about changing what may be an entrenched culture?
I think first it's actually understanding the experience of people who are using services, so to get a baseline, because the social workers might think that they're operating entirely appropriately, they're meeting all their performance targets, but actually, what does it feel like for individuals? Do individuals and their families feel more supported? So I would actually argue that we need to find out, not just on the annual survey, but to actually understand what that experience of care and support from what I would say is our customers looks and feels like to get a baseline. So we might think, or authorities might think they're doing a good job, but what does it look and feel like for individuals, and getting the user feedback. The other part we can do is actually about co-production, engaging more in co-production, getting individuals who use services in the recruitment of staff, looking at more about the social values and what that looks and feels like when they're appointing staff. So things like that we can actually engage in, but it's important to understand what people's experiences are versus what social workers think it is.
So more time and patience needed to get to the bottom of a young carer's life, or is it more expertise? Is there a doctor in the house? Could others learn from the medical profession, whose diagnostic skills are often put to the test under extreme time pressure?
We usually have only 10 minutes, and it's very, very difficult to do everything we want to do. But I think when someone walks into our room, most of the clinicians are focused on that need of that individual, the person. Despite all the time constraints, I think there's always an opportunity for GPs to engage with these carers and other people and try to identify their needs.
One of the points that young carers make is about the attitude of professionals. Indeed, others have commented on entrenched professional attitudes. It may be the nature of your profession as a doctor is different, say, from the starting point of other professionals. What would you say to those professionals who perhaps take a hard-hearted attitude, some young carers say, to identifying the young carer and sometimes, in fact, ignoring the young carer? What sort of professional advice would you give?
I think the Royal College and some other organizations have done a lot of work with regional practitioners and other clinicians to make them aware about the role of the carers and how we can support them. So I think in the 5 to 6 years, especially, I've seen a lot of clinicians, including GPs, who are engaging with the carers. I've seen the mindset of the GPs, although you do find that some of the clinicians who still they may not have changed. And I think it's really, really important to be acknowledge the contribution made by these carers and identify and support them. For example, I'll give you an example. In Hertfordshire, we have Eastern North Hart, clinical commissioning in the group, and they have a scheme the way they have incentivized the GP practices to identify the carers. So all the practices in Eastern North Hart and the CCG have been asked to identify at least 3% of the carers within the practices. And I think it's a first step towards the better identification and growth of carers.
We'll hear more from 16-year-old Fern later in the programme. On the receiving end of the new duty to seek out and support young carers are the local authorities. Sandwell Borough Council in the West Midlands is one of 6 trailblazer councils across the UK. Their response illustrates the practical approach that some local authorities are adopting to try to bridge the young carer identification gap.
The ideal is to try to work with carers much earlier, so they don't have to go into that crisis situation where, safeguarding or child protection. Something I've put in place over the last few years is prevention work. We call it early help, but basically it's about working with families and identifying problems and concerns in families as early as possible.
One of the difficulties that young carers tell us on Carers World Radio is that when does just simply helping your family out become something more than that? And they've told us they find it difficult to identify this sort of step, if you like. How then can you or your fellow professionals actually identify the step?
I think for me it's about what does the young person want, regardless of what statutory definition that may be. If that young person needs help, they need help. I was talking to young carers and I was asking them, why did it take so long for them to approach somebody for help? And what one of them said to me was, and it's always stuck with me over these last 3 years, is that they were frightened to say anything because they thought they may be taken into care.
In other local authority areas, it may not be quite as proactive. What would you say to other local authorities who are hard pushed on the financial front? They're hard pushed under pretty much most circumstances, and therefore it's either dealing with children in need, as in children requiring protection or nothing.
If you don't work with children and young people early on, you're not going to prevent those problems from escalating, and you're going to have to deal with it at the other end, which could be the safeguarding or child protection end. So if you're looking at it from a crude perspective, it's in local authorities' best interest to be identifying problems and concerns in families as early as possible.
One young carer has told us that he wishes social care professionals of all types and descriptions, from police to social services to schools to local authorities, would follow their heart and not the textbook, really indicating perhaps an attitude from his own experience that he doesn't feel he's been well treated.
Something I set up in Sandwell was as part of the social workers induction training, is that young carers were part of that training for social workers, and that they met with social workers, and social workers could hear firsthand from young carers, the experiences that they had, what was good, what was bad, and how can we improve practice. There's probably more that we could do in terms of other agencies doing a similar thing as well.
From local authorities to the wider picture, NHS England is planning to have the conversations that so many young carers believe is the way for the authorities to live up to their legal, and in some cases what they would say are moral, obligations to take the initiative, seek out and support young carers.
We're trying to make sure that young carers' voices are heard directly in conversations, but also directly through the resources that they've produced with us.
Dave, how much is this where there's a will, there's a way?
We're resolute to that. We want to hear from young carers about their experiences of being a young carer. We can't second guess and presume what they are. So, if we can hear from young carers, then we can do something about it. If we don't hear, we can't.
So is it down to the young carer then?
Well, we have our mechanism through which we can engage and find things out. I'm a recent convert to Twitter, and I've picked up a number of issues that way. But, we're easily contactable.
But with the two acts, the Care Act and the Children and Families Act, is it not the onus on local authorities, for example, to go out and find young carers rather? Because young carers tell us that it's often difficult to talk to adults, so they can't get over that barrier.
No, I'd absolutely agree, and I think you'll see barriers and stigma related to being a carer, whatever age you are. I think the challenge we have as health providers is that the legal duty sits with local authorities and not us. And so it's our role to really try and build that duty of cooperation, which is what Dave has been really working hard on through the Memorandum of Understanding between health and social care.
But for some professionals, the situation is almost too close to home, but all the more informed for that personal experience.
I had experience as a young carer myself, and actually I have a long-term health condition. So my mum was a carer to me as I was growing up, and actually I have a daughter now. So, that's something that's impacted on my life, as an individual, and it just so happens that this has become part of my professional life. In terms of how we support that, I think as an output as an organisation, we make sure that we're always listening to carers, and so we have panels of carers that work with the organisation to develop how we move forward. And we've also just employed a carer who's chosen hours and chosen where she works to fit around her and her current existing lifestyle, to create content for the website Carers Club, to make sure that actually we're talking from a real carer perspective, and the issues that really are from carers, not from what as we as a health organisation think are the issues. So I think we're addressing it. I think there's a long way to go for many organisations, but hopefully if we all beat the drum very quietly, there'll be a loud bang in the end.
Campaigning charity The Carers Trust published a report that highlights the issue that we're discussing here on Carers World Investigates. Their report, titled Invisible and in Distress, sums up all too vividly the impact on young carers of not being sought out and supported by local authorities. Their survey showed that responses across the UK are patchy.
There are fantastic local organisations who have a real strong sense of what young carers need, what young adult carers need, how the whole family can be worked with. And with the work we're doing on mental health, what we're hoping is those kind of islands of really good practice can be connected up so much more with all those other organisations that maybe are providing services generally for young people but aren't aware so much of young carers. Or in other cases they can just join up the good work they're doing so that there's more kind of access to support for young carers. They might get a referral to a mental health service they really need, or support for their family that would have a positive impact on their mental health.
How do you get to the ones who aren't doing the job?
I think it's a really interesting time when support is changing. there's so much going on that it's really interesting to find out what different local authorities are doing, and I think we're still finding out a lot about how local authorities are going to work with their new duties, how it's going to be implemented, and the ways that good practice can be shared. I think there's a lot still to learn.
Earlier on you mentioned conversations in relation to preparation of the report Invisible and in Distress. Are we talking, in Fern's words, real conversations between people, or more of an online conversation, more of a remote conversation?
It's been a real mix, and that's taken into account the reality of young carers' lives, young adult carers' lives. I've loved those opportunities where I've got to speak face-to-face with young carers and young adult carers, and over the course of the Time to Be Heard project, which Carers Trust runs, which is making sure decision makers hear from young adult carers, we've spoken to thousands of young adult carers and heard from them directly at events, at discussion groups. They've directed our work. We've heard from them as, really full and really interesting conversations. On the other hand, it's important that we reach out online to young carers and young adult carers, because that might be the only way they can be part of that discussion. So I think a whole mix of different ways has been really valuable.
And that message about the importance of mental health is stressed by work going on in the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames.
The idea is that they get some presentations about mental health, how to look after their mental health, encouraging them to seek help if they have problems with their mental health. And then they go back and develop an action plan on mental health in their school. And so it means we're kind of creating ambassadors for mental health in schools. And we're trying to develop a sustainable way for schools to think about mental health, the mental health of their pupils, and making sure that pupils' mental health improves and their understanding about local services, where to seek help, what to do if they're feeling low. We're encouraging that to happen in schools across the borough.
To Parliament now, and how the issue of young carers is viewed in the corridors of power. Whatever the political colour, there seems to be a measure of cross-party agreement on the need for local authorities to live up to their responsibilities, to seek out and support young carers as required by the Care Act and the Children and Families Act. For some, the issue is ensuring that mental health is treated equally, or in the jargon, enjoys parity of esteem with physical health.
Within the whole debate about parity of esteem, there's certain groups which are kind of hidden. And what struck me talking to the young carers is to get more visibility about their experience of mental health and how that fits into the whole conversation about how we need to improve mental health policy.
To what extent do you think that professionals of all sorts, GPs, police, social workers, the full spectrum, are stuck in a rut, maybe, in a mindset, and that mindset to the young carers who've been speaking to us says, you don't believe me, I'm a child?
There's something in that. I think that there are, across the whole of our health system, systems and cultural barriers to addressing some of these issues. Getting GPs at primary care level, getting teachers in school environments across the community to recognise the signals and the issues that are being raised by young carers. I think there is a lot more work that needs to be done on that.
So in a sense, does this all come down to what one young carer summarised as, why can't the professionals follow their heart and not the textbook?
I think that's an interesting observation. I mean, I think across the piece, some of the things that prevent us from achieving some of these issues of parity in the system are to do with professional habits, to do with systems of cultures that have built up over a very long period of time with the best intentions. And I think in order to make progress, we need to be, we need to have the courage to challenge some of those systems and cultures, so that we can actually achieve the goals that we want to achieve.
For one MP, though, the responsibility placed on local authorities by the two acts does not go far enough. When Labour Shadow Minister Barbara Keeley first put forward her private members' bill that was ultimately talked out of parliamentary time by the Conservatives, the burden was going to fall more widely on the range of professionals involved in the identification of young carers.
The duty with respect to young carers and to carers wouldn't just fall on local authorities. It would, in the case of young carers, also include schools within the area of the local authority's control, as well as children's services, FE and HE colleges to have duties with respect to student carers, but also, really importantly, the NHS bodies, which is people like GPs, hospital doctors. And I think trying to put the whole of the duty onto local authorities just misses the point that, since the care cuts we've had, really a very small group of people in any local authority area are getting support now that the eligibility criteria will have changed.
Legal expert on the programme, Professor Luke Clement, says that both acts, the Care Act and the Children and Families Act, carry no penalties for non-compliance. Does that, in your view, further dilute the situation?
It does. There's been work done over recent times by Carers UK to ask councils how much they're doing, and in fact I think in one study they did, only 2% of councils that they contacted mentioned young carers at all. So that's not a very good sign, if there's a duty and they don't have to comply with it. Of course we know that local authorities are struggling with cuts and that they've lost staff and that they continue to have further cuts. But, if this is to be meaningful, then, clearly there has to be some link to checking the outcomes and checking that the duty is actually being carried out.
To what extent do you think this is not so much a matter of money, more a matter of hardened professional attitudes that need to change?
Well, I think it's all linked, sadly. If you think about any service that is provided, social care or health services in an area, carers and young carers provide a very large proportion of that care. They are the people providing the care. So those professionals ought to be working with them. I think there's this view that, they're getting on with it, so let's just leave them to it. And in the case of young carers, that's just totally wrong, because they're losing their childhood. It's having an impact on their education. It's having all kinds of impact on their health and well-being. So let's not just keep attitudes that say, well, if things appear to be all right, I'll just leave them as they are.
As a part of that, do you think there's an element of hiding behind the forms rather than getting down to actually speaking to young carers? Because that's what young carers tell us, that there's no conversation.
It's very important to listen to young carers. I went to meet a group of young carers in Salford recently because we have a very good young carers project, and I was quite surprised at some of the things they told me. I mean, I thought certain schools in our area were pretty good at supporting them till they told me, what they actually find day to day, and all kinds of examples where they were not getting the support they should have got. So I think it's very, very important for people, working around this area of care, NHS, social care, to have that listening to young carers. It should be a key part of what they do.
While for Barbara Keeley MP, the net of responsibility for identifying young carers should be cast more widely, the Liberal Democrat peer Baroness Claire Tyler of Enfield believes that there is another force at work.
The real concern is that there's just not enough money in the system to actually make sure that those things happen in practice.
We've spoken to the Association of School and College Leaders, who produced a report on the mental health of young children, and they quite clearly told us that teachers were well trained and exercised the common sense, whereas the National Police Chiefs Council said actually what frontline police officers are doing is not good enough. We recognise that, and we're really trying to improve it. So you've got two professional bodies as part of this spectrum for young carers, one accepting a reality and the other not a reality if young carers are to be believed in what they say.
That's a very, very interesting sort of different perspective and approach. I mean, I think it's quite refreshing actually to hear the police are taking that attitude. I suspect they know that they've still got quite a lot to do in terms of police really having this issue sort of, if you like, at the front of their thinking, and knowing really what to do when they come across youngsters who've clearly got caring responsibilities which are, really way beyond what should be expected of them. I mean, I know from talking to people in schools that some schools actually are really understand this issue and are trying to do the right thing, but I suspect with other schools that there's actually a long way to go before they're really sort of understanding and helping staff in schools to, first of all, just to identify young carers, because I think part of the problem is often that their needs are, or what they're doing is quite invisible. But, it shouldn't really be that difficult, I think, to ask sort of some quite simple questions, particularly perhaps when a young person is consistently late. And the reason why they're late is because they're having to help perhaps a parent or a relative in the house get up, get dressed, get their breakfast for them, and take perhaps younger siblings to school before they can even think about getting to school themselves. I mean, these are signals, it seems to me, it should be fairly straightforward to pick up.
And for others, it remains about the real, down-to-earth conversation that Fern and other young carers believe is the key to improving the chances of being identified and supported.
you have those people communicating across channels, because actually it might take a conversation with a teacher to have a conversation with a health worker, a support worker, or whoever it may be, to really get that rounded sense of a young person and of their daily challenges or what support would be adequate. And I think ultimately you can have all these people working in their own confines, but if they're not coming together, if they're not perhaps linking up and joining up what is in the best interest of that young person, then you're not going to get the level of service delivery or the outcomes that you want for that young person either.
And above all, professionals have to believe what young carers are telling them.
Absolutely, and I think it's a kind of damning indictment of young people now that we question their intentions, that we doubt them, and do you know what? There are many adults that we could doubt or question as well, so there shouldn't be a stigma around being a young person. If a young person indicates that they need help or support, then I think the first priority should be to make sure that we look beyond that and see what they need and try and support that, because it's very rare that a young person will ask for help, I think. So perhaps we need to pay more attention and stop stigmatising young people as well.
While there are three other main political perspectives, when it's about decision making, there are two ministers. At the Department for Education, Minister Edward Timpson is clear what he wants when it comes to fighting for a consistent approach to raising social worker standards.
I think the two principal ways that we're seeking to try and improve that level of consistency across the country, one is clearly bearing down on failure. Any system's only as good as the people who work within it. We need to have high quality social work wherever it's needed. And that's why, through the Chief Social Worker for Children, Isabel Trowler, we have the new knowledge and skills, the core elements every social worker will now be judged against through an assessment accreditation process, why we put a lot of money into Step Up to Social Work and also into Frontline to get the best graduates into social work. But there's another element to this, which is how can we do things differently so that those who are able to provide the best possible service are not being stymied by either the processes in which they work within or by the barriers and the protocols that often we're responsible for putting in their way. And that's why the innovation programme has been key in trying to spark a very different approach, different thinking about how we deliver children's services. I think that's going to be key as we go forward as to how we establish a really strong system which has the right levers of accountability, that has the right people doing the right things at the right time.
And across the departmental divide, the Department of Health's Minister for Care and Support, the Right Honourable Alistair Burt MP, told me what progress he believes is being made to spur social care professionals into action.
In the spring of last year, we helped ADAS and the Association Directors of Children's Services develop additional information for social care practitioners working with adults and children to help them understand the new legislation and the benefits of a whole family approach to assessment. And that will inevitably involve the appropriate changes to practice and culture designed to help. Our Chief Social Worker at the Department of Health, Lynn Romeo, is leading a piece of work linking social work theory and practice specifically to carer assessment and support under the Care Act. And I've been out with professional social workers, quite recently to talk to them about the changes that they're making in response to the Care Act. And some of that does indeed involve changes in culture and the like. The department has also invested £2 million in a programme of work by Carers UK, Carers Trust, Royal College of GPs and Royal College of Nursing to raise carer awareness. And some of that includes the recruitment of GP carer champions and the recruitment of school nurses to reach out to schools. So in these ways, we're going directly to professionals, working with professionals to meet not only the needs of the Care Act, but also what carers are telling us about the need for the culture to be responsive. And again, I'm always keen to identify best practice, because one of the things that I've noticed since being in the role is you can have places where there's really good practice next door to places where it's poor, and actually that transfer of best practice is really important.
There is a feeling in some quarters amongst some young carers that the professionals don't really see the true impact of not having a conversation.
I suspect professionals would be disappointed to hear that, but they'd also find it important because in my experience, their determination to want to do the best for those they're working with is very strong. I think the whole issue of mental health problems for young people has risen very much up the political and social agenda. We've had the recent publication of the Mental Health Task Force, for example. There's been the commitment of resources by the government, £1.4 billion to be put into children and adolescent mental health services over the 5 years of this Parliament. And within that, a recognition that carers, young carers in particular, of course, have particular stresses and concerns. So the local transformation programme, the work that all local authorities are doing with young people with mental health issues, should be now beginning to identify those with particular issues, and those will certainly include some young carers. And it is essential they get the support and encouragement and identification of their issues that they need.
This programme is featuring the story of Fern, whose experiences, whilst being seen perhaps as extreme, reflect the common elements of most young carers' stories and histories. I asked her when I interviewed her what she would say direct to you if she was in front of you. This is what she had to say.
Them to actually speak to us instead of going through workers, a manager to a worker, actually go to the problem and speak to the people. As I said, we've all got different views, where I would have different views to someone that would be raised differently but still a young carer. I will always have that different and sensitive where I've grown up, and I'd want them to actually know we are important, and you're getting paid for your job. You should actually be doing more than just reading a form of this person wants to go with this person, whereas that's all they're doing. And is that kind of, I really want to see someone that had been a young carer be in these set of jobs so they can put their point across, or someone that's still a young carer, because then they'd understand that, they have that insensitive, that motherly role that we want, whereas not just someone that's thinking, oh, I get a high pay at the end of the year, I get this at the end of the month, where, that's not going to make a chance to our lives. They should be thinking, well, I'm getting paid for this. This must mean not just because I've gone into this line of work, I want to go into this line of work. And that must mean they're not, because if they were, then they should be doing something by now.
The Department of Health has published the Carers Consultation Strategy, and you've had a go at filling in the form. What are your thoughts on it?
Diabolical. I didn't hardly understand certain things. It was too long, and as I say, if I was now at home and I was trying to do that certain survey, I would find it very hard because I wouldn't have the time to fill it out. I wouldn't think to myself, oh, let's look on the government or somewhere like that to see if they're now doing a survey for these certain things. I wouldn't think of that, and even if I did, as I said, the questions that were on there were what they wanted to hear, the answers that we could only put that they want to hear, that they already know, not what they should be looking at, and not what, like I said, an individual. It's not just a wide range, it's looking at certain people and the way we need help and asking us, because it means more. As I say, for someone to come up to you and say, what do you think? How are you today? Rather than, I'll fill out this form and then possibly one day something might change, because I don't see no improvement. There's no development within, doing a survey that's now going to be put into a tally chart or a bar chart or something like that that's going to read it, where they're not going to actually read the answers, they're going to read the outcome of the things, which is hard because, you want to say so much, but your actual writing answers aren't going to be that. I'd rather have someone send me a piece of paper even than, send me a form, because then I can say what I want, I can include what I want, and they've got to read it. They can't just put a scanner across it and get it up onto a statistics that aren't going to matter to us. There used to be the fact of people saying children should be seen, not heard, whereas I think that's totally wrong. We should be both, and in reality we should be heard a lot more than the adults, because we are the generation. We were going to be the ones to take over one day. We're going to be the ones to be in these line of jobs, the ones that are prime ministers, ones that are, coming to MPs. We need to acknowledge it now, because if not, our generations are just going to get worse, and it's showing because, as I said, you're not growing up nowadays learning that punishment's wrong. You're getting learned up as, you're bad. You're now getting attention. If you're good, then you'll get praised up. But if you're struggling and you just don't know who to go to, you're ignored, and that's wrong, because sometimes they're the kids with the most potential and the ones that actually want to do something.
Minister, What's your reaction to what Ferns had to say?
Firstly, in relation to the face-to-face conversation that she prefers, I mean, that's really important, and I think that, again, is a very important message for professionals. Above all, carers want people to understand what they're going through. I'm president of Carers in Bedfordshire and have been for some years, so I've had some exposure to carers, mostly adult carers. They are desperate to be with other people, to talk directly to people responsible for those that they're caring for. And I think when Fern expresses that's very important and absolutely right. In terms of the general remarks about MPs and ministers and everything, most of us come into being members of Parliament because we're activists in some way, worried about something or other, and we believe that activism could be partially satisfied by being engaged with a process which was designed to produce answers as well as raise issues. Campaigners raise issues. Politicians, at the end of the day, have the responsibility to solve them and to make decisions, and it's not always easy to do. Very few politicians are motivated by anything financial. We do the job as best we can because we're committed to doing the job, and we have lots of different issues to cover. But most MPs, when they are dealing one-to-one with constituents who come and see them with issues, will take them as an issue, will often find out much more about it than other members of the public would do, and then be in a position to help further.
What are her thoughts on your own department's consultation online form for the carers strategy?
Sorry about that. The department did work very hard to get this right, and it certainly, on my request, consulted directly with carers, with representative organisations such as Carers UK, care professionals and others. It wasn't just devised either by ministers or a group of officials sitting in Whitehall. It was done in consultation with carers themselves to try and get the best form. I take a point that some people get very fazed by forms and completing them, and I think in Fern's position, what she or any other young carer might do is go to those that they're working with in local authorities, those who are helping them with their responsibilities at home, and say, look, sit down with me, go through this with me and help me out. All sorts of people need help in completing forms and questionnaires and things like that. And I would much rather she sat down with someone and went through it that way. But in addition, the department has recognised, I've recognised that some people want to talk about these things as well as just complete the forms. There'll be a number of round tables that the department is organising around the country where this can be done. And we're also actively encouraging local authorities around the country to hold such round tables themselves, so that people can come in, talk directly, make a contribution that way, if that's the best way they want to do with it, and then we will get feedback from such sessions. But there is no way in which a consultation like this could have been done only by face-to-face individual consultations. 6.5 million carers across the UK altogether. This, we hope, is the best way of combining the acquisition of knowledge both online and through some direct contact.
She also said that it looked like it was designed for professionals to get the answers the government was looking for.
It's not, because we're quite open about wanting to hear from people. We don't necessarily have any ready answers at the moment. I certainly don't have a list on my desk of what I'm going to say when the consultation is completed. And by going directly to carers, representatives of carers, to help us divide the questionnaire, I don't think they could be accused of being complicit in the government in producing certain answers. Everyone always has suspicions about what government is up to. I understand that. But in this particular case, we are as open as we can be in wanting to hear from carers about the sort of things that will make their difference, without in any way, being honest about it, being in a position to say to each and every one, well, there'll be sort of a large financial change at the end of this process. Because there are things that make a difference where money isn't involved. It's those sort of things that are likely to make as much difference to anyone as any financial commitment.
When all's said and done, as a government, you've improved the rights of carers, as many acknowledge, by increasing the obligations on local authorities. But at the same time, other parts of government have cut the money available to you. Is it not an impossible mismatch out of which real progress can possibly come?
I think that's a very honest and straightforward question, and I hope my reply will be equally honest. Yes, we have made changes. I think the previous government and ours have tried to recognise that we're in a society where people are accepting obligations on behalf of others, family members and others. There is an issue, particularly with younger carers, because sadly, some parents and families simply can't cope, and the burden falls on a younger member. And we're trying to identify those much more than in the past. But in terms of financial support and everything, it cannot all be done by government and the state. The numbers of people involved are just too large, and there are obligations that can and should be handled by those closest to people, ensuring that what resources the government does have, and the government has no resources of its own, the government has the resources of those friends, neighbours and others who pay their taxation and everything else, that those resources are there for those most in need. So it will always be a combination. We know that the burden being carried by the millions of carers is a fantastically important one. Government couldn't do the job that it does. We couldn't look after people unless those carers were involved, and they are an absolutely key component. So we want to help them as much as possible, whilst saying at the same time it won't be possible for all these burdens to be lifted from you. But when you are most in need, when the need is at its most extreme, that is where government assistance needs to be placed, and that's why we need to ensure we have the resources to do that. And we won't have the resources to do that if money is being constantly spent on things where other people can and do indeed, pick up the burdens and look after people as they wish to and as they want to in relation to their loved ones, with government support in the background. The challenge is very difficult. It's not impossible in a society such as ours for us to devise a system to care for those most in need, but for us to shoulder our own burdens. I think there's hardly a family in the country that isn't looking after somebody somewhere. And we've got family experience of that, and I don't think we're any different to any others. So I hope the combination works as well as it can, but constantly looking for new ways to support carers, I think that's an important obligation the government is ready to meet.
The Minister for Care and Support at the Department for Health, the Right Honourable Alistair Burt MP, speaking exclusively to Carers World Investigates. So, from a current minister to a former Secretary of State for Health. When both acts were mere parliamentary bills, the Right Honourable Stephen Dorrell told us at Carers World Radio that the Health and Education departments had allowed young carers to be left out in the cold, falling into the gap between two government ministries. Now he has a message for the government that legislation is not the end of the story, and as young carers have been telling us, it is only the beginning of identifying and supporting their needs, conversations being the watchword.
I think what we've got here is an absolutely classic case of a very familiar phenomenon, which is that there's a tendency in Westminster and Whitehall to think you write a new piece of legislation, and there you are, problem done, problem solved. Actually, that's the beginning of the process, not the end. What we need to do is to have a proper development of practice by professionals, experienced by young carers, so that they receive the support that they need, and as a society all of us want to provide, but somehow between the wish and the action there's a gap that hasn't been filled. There's never enough money to do everything you want to do, so it is about priorities. It was famously said a long time ago that to govern is to choose. I think it was an Aaron Bevan that said the language of politics is the language of priorities. And surely to goodness, in a society that is seeking to develop more community support, to enable people to lead lives in the community rather than failing in the community and having to have expensive and less good care in institutions, there cannot be a higher priority than ensuring that there is proper support for the carer community, for young carers, but actually, of course, this is a subset of a broader issue about providing proper support for carers so that we are a supportive, caring community.
What would your message be to professionals listening to this programme about how to make some real change for young carers?
Well, I think actually most people in caring professions don't need a former politician to tell them that it is, as you said, about a conversation. It's not. It's about support and being able to offer advice, but it's also about listening. A conversation is a two-way process. and developing professional practice so that they engage with young carers and listen to what the young carer needs and ensure that is provided.
What better way to bring this programme almost to a close than to remind you how a group of young carers from Surrey came to be identified.
It was through my mum, because she has a friend who has a carer herself, and she talked to my mum about it, and then my mum talked to me about it, and then we got into touch with young carers. I also had an assembly about young carers where I sort of thought to myself that I might actually be one.
Mine's actually a really backward story. So I was just sat in the doctor's waiting room with my mum, and my mum can talk to absolutely anyone, and we're just talking about my brothers having ADHD and Asperger's and stuff like that. And they went, oh, she might be a young carer. We didn't really think anything of it. So then we went to school, and then I got involved with this pastoral team. And I was like, oh, you're actually a young carer, and it just progressed from there. That's how I got recognised.
Mine started off when my mum started recognising that I started taking more of a role from my brother. So she contacted Surrey Young Carers and had them send out a member of staff to one of my schools and started getting recognised and more noticeable.
My mum has a friend who's an ex-nurse, and the ex-nurse recognised me and already knew of Surrey Young Carers and put us in contact with them.
I was recognised as a Surrey Young Carer when I was 12, when at school I started showing up to classes late and not handing in homework that was to a high standard, and they started asking me why, and I didn't feel comfortable telling them it was because I was looking after my brother, because I thought it was just something every child has to do. But then it was only until they assessed me and found out that I was doing a lot more than the average child does, and that's when I got put into Surrey Young Carers.
And in the end, it is the social worker that recognises what young carers such as Fern have repeatedly told us is the key to progress: a simple conversation.
In terms of having a conversation with children and young people, it is absolutely critical. And social workers as a profession should be actively engaging with children and young people, particularly carers, who are doing an incredibly tough and often unrecognised job, who do need support and help. And it's how social workers are provided with the time and the tools to actually support young people in the community. And when I talk about time, it's about social workers not sitting behind desks, filling out forms and assessment forms, but actually being given the time to develop relationships and positive rapport with children.
What are the trends like in social work in terms of that, being able to guard that relationship basis to your work?
To be perfectly honest, Tom, I think it's really challenging at the moment in the sector. And we often hear from social workers who are saying that the volume of work is actually increasing, and children, young people and families that are making contact have more complex needs. We're hearing that people are actually pressured to take on additional what we call casework, and that they're actually having less direct contact with children or having enough time with families that they want to be spending time with. And we would say that's where the shift needs to happen, that there needs to be, more focus on what we call relationship-based social work, getting to know children and families, developing trust, developing a rapport, and really understanding what's going on for children. What we must not lose sight of is listening to what children are telling people. Sadly, from some of the stories that you've recounted, children are still saying that they are not being listened to, and we need to change that.
And one of the things that Fern and other young carers tell us is that when there is a visit from a social worker pending, there is a fear within the family unit, no matter what the issues there, that the family is going to get broken up. In the more general context, social workers do have a negative image, and perhaps this fuels it or doesn't it. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's really important for young people and carers, young carers who are fearful, to actually try and talk to somebody as a starting point about what's actually going on for them in terms of their life and their experiences. And what I would say is that social workers do not go into the profession to break up families.
I've been working in the field for over 30 years, and I can assure you I did not go into this profession to take children away from families and to not support people in the way that they need to be supported.
You seem to be saying that that first point of contact is the critical moment.
Absolutely, absolutely, Tom, because I think it's about who does that young person feel safe enough to initially tell, I'm actually caring for somebody. And that could be a dinner lady, it could be a teacher, as I said, it could be somebody working in the community, it could be a social worker. But what is really important is the starting point of believing a child. And if a child or a young person is actually sharing that this is going on in their lives, please believe them. That's the call that I would say. Believe what children are saying. I think there's something about fundamental values and humanity. And in terms of contact with carers or anyone in this situation, it's about a value of kindness, it's about a value of respect, of decency, it's about active listening, and by that I mean really listening to what that young person is actually saying.
In the end, it is not professionals talking amongst themselves that will advance the rights of young carers, but that first point of contact, the application of the values of humanity, respect, decency, personal care and true listening that will lead to progressing the rights of young carers, not two laws without true penalties. If you feel that this programme has struck a chord with you, please get in touch and tell us what you think on the issue of young carers or anything else that makes you feel passionate on the issue of caring. I'm Tom Magner, you're listening to Carers World Investigates, brought to you on carersworldradio.com, radio with pictures and a purpose.